Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. My name is Nadia. On the program this week, we are delighted to be joined by former head of SEPA, Campbell Gemmell, and Campbell is a consultant of the OECD and honorary professor at the University of Glasgow. Welcome, Campbell.
Hi there, Nadia. Thank you.
And we are also delighted to welcome Francis Coppola, a respected economist who is well known putting Nigel Farage straight about banking. Good afternoon, Francis, and welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Nadia. I'll never live that down, will I?
To start, we will begin with Ukrainian update. Vladimir Putin has told Donald Trump in a 50-minute phone call on Saturday that Moscow is ready to hold a fresh round of peace talks with Kiev after 22nd June, once the sides complete exchanging prisoners and soldiers' bodies. Putin and Trump discussed the escalating situation in Middle East and Ukraine peace talks. According to Putin's aide Yuri Yushakov, Trump posted on social media that Putin had called wish him a happy birthday and to discuss the Iran-Israel crisis. Trump said, he wills, as do I, this war in Israel-Iran should end, to which I explained his war should also end. Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky has not commented on whether Ukraine would agree to a next round of talks, only saying that the exchanges will be completed and the parties will discuss the next step. Zelensky urged the United States to shift tone in its dialogue with Russia, saying it was too warm and would not help to end the fighting. He said he hoped that escalation between Israel and Iran would not result in a drop in military aid to Kiev, according to the remarks published on Saturday. The recent escalation sparked fears Washington might relocate resources at its expense to beef up the defense of Israel, which unleashed a large-scale attack on Iran Friday. Zelensky has said that a sharp rise in global oil prices following Israeli strikes on Iran will benefit Russia and bolster its military capabilities in the war in Ukraine. Speaking to journalists in Kiev, Zelensky said the surge in oil prices threatened Ukraine's position on the battlefield, especially because Western allies have not forced effective price caps on Russian oil exports. Earlier on Saturday, Ukraine and Russia swapped prisoners in the fourth such exchange this week, part of a large-scale plan to bring back 1,000 wounded prisoners from each side and return the bodies of dead soldiers. The prisoner agreement was the only viable result of two recent rounds of talks in Istanbul. Zelensky said he expected the prisoner swaps to continue until 20 or 21st of June. Zelensky said on Saturday that Ukrainian forces had recaptured Andriivka village in northeastern Sumy region. Zelensky also claimed successful actions near Pokrovsk for months, a focus of Russian attacks in their slow advance on the Eastern Front, and strong results near Kupiansk, an area in northeastern Ukraine that has come under heavy Russian pressure. Russia's defense ministry said on Saturday that its forces had seized the village of Zeleny Kut, southwest of Pokrovsk. Zelensky said Ukrainian troops had maintained defensive lines along more than 1,000 kilometers of the front line. He also dismissed Moscow's claims that Russian troops had crossed into the central Ukrainian region of Dnipropetrovsk borders, three regions that are partially occupied by Russia: Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. Russia now controls about 1/5 of Ukrainian territory. Campbell and Francis. Campbell, can we discuss a few minutes about the topics which I have discussed right now?
Yeah, I suppose the remarkable thing is that the whole Ukraine crisis is carrying on, and we're in a period where it feels as if there are squirrels everywhere. There are lots and lots of distractions that mean that we're not necessarily, the mainstream media are not paying attention to what's going on in Ukraine. Clearly, the impact of the Russian war is carrying on, and loss of life is continuing, and the negative impact on the environment, etc. All of that is carrying on. Yes, there are prisoner exchanges and various other things going on, but we always know that the mainstream media has a relatively short span of attention, and sadly, that means that that's not really a focus issue. At the same time, we've got the Israeli Gaza situation, and Gaza has been pummeled now for a very extended period, and that is also being distracted from by the Israel strikes on nuclear-related facilities in Iran. And actually, another war, effectively what's going on in Sudan, is being ignored pretty much completely by the mainstream media, and even by those with enough time and energy to focus on additional issues. So yeah, it's a very unfortunate, messy situation, and I have to say, at times it almost feels, especially in the context of Israel Iran, that there is an almost deliberate element of distracting, active distraction, so that Gaza falls off the world's agenda. And although we had an interesting event of a yacht heading towards Israel with Greta Thunberg and some European elected representatives and others, that was treated almost as a kind of comical distraction, and it was very briefly dealt with. And actually, unusually, the media has obviously gone out of love with Greta Thunberg, so that was ignored. But it does mean that these absolutely crucial conflicts, these geostrategic events in Ukraine and in Gaza, are simply not getting the attention that they deserve. Now, whether or not any of our politicians have the mental bandwidth to handle all of this, I don't know, but it's pretty clear that the media don't. So it's good that we're talking about it, but it would be a great deal better if there were greater and more robust attention being paid to these really serious, damaging conflicts.
Thank you. Francis, like we have got 30 seconds. We will come to the Middle East war in the next topic, but like if we can concentrate on the
Yeah,
Ukraine
no, I was
right
going to
now.
focus on Ukraine actually, because I think the thing that strikes me is the utter failure of Donald Trump to achieve what he said he was going to do, which was to end the war in Ukraine. He's totally failed to do so. It's still going on. Russia is still attacking Ukraine. Ukraine is still attacking Russia. They are still fighting along the front line, and neither side is really taking much notice of Donald Trump, and that I'm not entirely sure how he digs himself out of the hole he's in.
Yeah.
Because increasingly, it seems to me, the backdrop to this is the decline of US relevance in the world, which is evident now. We can talk about this a little bit later on, but there is evident fall in US soft power, if you like, US ability to bully people into doing what it wants, is significantly reduced. And in a way, one of the reasons it's significantly reduced, I think, is precisely because Donald Trump went in trying to bully everybody, and nobody likes being bullied. And it's all backfired rather badly. No, so he hasn't ended the Ukraine war. He hasn't ended the Gaza war either. He hasn't managed to stop Israel hitting Iran. And there doesn't seem to be anything else he can stop either or prevent. So for me, that's the real issue here, is the, if you like, the beginning, I think, of the decline and fall of the US quasi-empire that has really kind of kept what has been known as the Pax Americana with increasing brutality for the better part of half a century. The post-World War II order is crumbling, and there doesn't seem to be anything we can do about it.
Thank you, Francis. We will move on to the Middle East update. At least 55,297 Palestinians have been killed and 128,426 wounded in Gaza since 7th of October 2023. Israel's attack on Iran have not stopped the killing in Gaza, despite the world's media moving its focus and need for more aid to be delivered becomes more desperate. Shall we discuss on the Israel has chosen now to attack on Iran, opportunism to reflect attention away from Gaza or to undermine a deal with the US, and what are the risks of the conflict escalating? Francis, I'll come to you first, and shall we discuss on, like, I've mentioned two things. One is, the Palestine situation, and we are not seeing any media coverage, because the media has, changed their topics to Iran-Israel conflict. So, shall we discuss this first?
Yeah, as you said in your introduction, the media does have a very short span of attention. So the moment you have some other event hitting the headlines, like Iran, Gaza drops off the agenda, as does Sudan permanently, of course. Nobody ever talks about Sudan, yet it is the most horrific situation. It's immensely hard to get any media attention. One of the effects, interestingly, of the Freedom Flotilla and a little bit the land convoy, though that's been held up in Egypt, has been to get a little bit of media attention back to Gaza. So from that point of view, you could say it was worthwhile doing, because for a little while, the media's attention was focused upon what was going on in Gaza. And you could say that was the whole point of the flotilla. It was not actually to deliver any meaningful aid. It was to get the world's attention to what was going on. And for a little while, for a short period of time, it did. And then Iran happened and everybody moved on again. The present situation in Gaza is that there is essentially no food being delivered, or virtually none. The thousands and thousands of desperate people are queuing up for aid deliveries, which they're being told about, which are then being cancelled at short notice, and in the last few days actually online, which they didn't have access to because Israel had cut the internet. And then Israel is shooting them when they try to access the aid. We are seeing daily massacres of kind of between 30 and 90 people daily, mostly young men, which isn't that surprising, because what happens in Palestine, generally in West Bank as well as Gaza, is that young men take on the responsibility for obtaining food for their families when times are hard. So it's young men mainly who are making the dangerous journey to the aid points and waiting there for food deliveries, and then being shot when they try to access the aid. There are exceptions. There are some women and some children being killed as well, but it is mainly young men. And my take on this, if I was being totally cynical, would be to say that this is intentional, that these aid distribution points are more like baited traps, really. They are intended to lure out Palestinian fighting age men, concentrate them in particular points, and then massacre them. I honestly think that is the intention, and that there's very little intention really to deliver any meaningful relief to the people of Gaza. When the distribution to young men fails, the women and children and elderly people who they are obtaining food for starve. The cutting the internet made me wonder whether Israel was planning something bigger, and as yet we don't know exactly what they did under cover of the internet, but we know there was a big massacre around the Nuseirat refugee camp. And I'd also want to mention, in relation to Palestine, that we shouldn't forget about what's going on in the West Bank. Israel has placed the West Bank under total lockdown. Settlers are continuing to ethnically cleanse. There are pogroms going on all over the West Bank, really, particularly Ramallah and Hebron and places like that. In villages, they are setting fire to the villages and driving out their residents. They're doing that all the time. They are never stopped. The village that was featured in the Oscar-winning documentary No Other Land, that those villages have been ethnically cleansed. Some of the residents are still trying to hang on, I think, but it's been deliberate destruction. They've been kicked out and their homes bulldozed. We shouldn't forget that this is going on, and that perhaps one thing that's got very little attention is Israel's finance minister essentially shutting down Palestine's banks, in much the same way that the ECB shut down Greece's banks during the Greek crisis, which deprived Palestine, so the West Bank and Gaza, of money. Which makes, of course, if you deprive a whole authority, a whole area of money, it's just increasing incredibly difficult for people to live. And so that's going on in both areas. Now, I would say that Israel is actually waging war on Palestine, generally, not just on Gaza, and I think we should bear that in mind.
Thank you, Francis. And Campbell?
Yeah, very hard to disagree with anything that Francis said there. Trying to think of additional dimensions, I suppose. Thinking about the motivation, it's always hard, and why should we try to get inside the heads of madmen? But Netanyahu has been clinging on desperately to power for a very long time. And he and his far-right religious zealots that control the government of Israel are clearly still enjoying significant support from major Western backers, the US, the UK, and others. I do not know how long that can continue. We don't know whether Trump greenlit the Iranian operation or not, but it's pretty easy to see that previous presidents in the US held Israel back from such outright direct attacks on Iran. And this is no longer the case. The restraints are off. And I suppose because the US government is behaving in such an extraordinary manner in terms of deconstructing global strategic roles and the US's connection, as Francis was saying earlier on, with its traditional roles of at least certain elements of global diplomacy. All of that is effectively gone, and it's behaving extraordinarily towards its own people, including these various attacks on democratic politicians and various other things that, if they're not caused by the administration, they're certainly facilitated, enabled, encouraged, and are a reaction to elements of the Republican president's performance. So Israel effectively still has a free hand. The Israeli government has a free hand to behave in this extraordinary manner. So notwithstanding everything that's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank, we've seen Israel attacking other neighboring states and having an impact on other neighboring states. And clearly Iran is a significant target. Now, there were peace talks underway, arms-related talks, sorry, and the development of nuclear capabilities in Iran, talks around those. All of these have effectively been kiboshed by the behavior of Israel. So it's hard to believe that they perceive an end game, that Netanyahu perceives an end game other than absolute victory and wiping out anybody that doesn't fit the sort of greater Israel model. And it's hard not to see that as being very similar to the US, that, those who are not with us are against us. There's a paranoia about anybody who holds a different view or has a different religion or has a different approach to society. So I don't see how this stops. I see Israel having to be held back at some point, but I wonder just how far it goes and how much damage is done. I think Gaza has very little chance of short-term or medium-term survival, and I don't know what happens after that other than Israeli complete occupation. With Iran, I think it's very different, and I wonder, given that regime change seems to be part of the agenda, not just the disabling of the nuclear program, how does that play out? And does that create new contorted alliances in the Middle East? It's an extraordinary, complicated, and very dangerous mess.
Thank you. And about Iran and Putin, like we had discussed a bit, Putin, is he benefiting out of this Israel-Iran war? Yeah, Campbell, you can go first here.
Yeah, Putin benefits from everything that distracts from focusing directly on him. So, yeah, seeing Western powers in disarray, seeing us not collectively paying attention to Ukraine, I mean, these are all things that Putin will find extremely entertaining. His long game of Greater Russia is clearly served by anything that is messy around the margins from which he might benefit. For me, one of the interesting things has been a slight change in the sort of the optics and the atmosphere around China's relationship with Russia, which has been supportive and tolerant, if not encouraging at certain times. But China seems to be rethinking how it relates to the UK and the EU, whilst also continuing its investments in global debt of various countries, but also its strategic interests in Africa and in Latin America. So, yes, Putin is benefiting from anything that does not hold him back, if I can put it as contortedly as that. So, yeah, I'm sure he is watching with great interest, with the memories of Syria and Afghanistan and the various other activities that he has been involved in over the years. He will be watching the neighbourhood very closely. But as Francis said earlier on, Putin has not been held back by Trump. Trump was going to fix everything in day one or early on, and hasn't managed to do that in Ukraine or in the Middle East. Who knows? But I would have thought Vladimir will be smiling of an evening.
Francis, would you like to add something onto that?
Yeah, if I might add to that, actually, that Russia and Iran are allies and have been for a long time, and Russia relies very much on Iran for supplies of weapons that it's using against Ukraine. So Putin has a very direct interest in what happens in Iran. And for that reason, it's very evident Israel is desperately trying to drag America into this war. It's actually explicitly said it wants America to hit one particular nuclear facility, which is for which Israel doesn't have the necessary ammunitions. And so far, America is resisting this, and with reason, because if America does that, then we are potentially in hot war territory between America and Russia. And I don't think we should ignore the wider geopolitical dimension here. This is not simply Israel pursuing essentially Netanyahu's long-term ambition to topple the Ayatollahs, which he's wanted for at least 30 years. And he's made repeated claims that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon, none of which have ever turned out to be true. He's been saying it for over 30 years. And we shouldn't forget that it was also Netanyahu who told Congress that Iraq was developing nuclear weapons, and that led directly to the Iraq war, which was based upon a lie. As we know, there were no weapons of mass destruction. They were not developing nuclear weapons. I'm not at all clear why we should believe Netanyahu this time. But the wider dimension of this is that I think America needs to stay well out of this. And I imagine that Putin will be, I guess, trying not to involve himself directly, but will be concerned about the effect on his own weapons supply.
Touching on America, we will go to the next topic. When Kim Jong-Donald woke up one morning, he saw that all the toys he had thrown out of his pram were lying all over the place. So he called his servants to line them up so he could inspect them and show off to the world what beautiful big toys he has. Being the USA, not the USSR or even the UK, Americans find his parade un-American and anti-democratic. Francis?
I was amused by the whole thing, actually, because the troops were so evidently not up for this. They kind of strolled along, kind of sort of rather shambolic fashion in their fatigues. And that was nothing like the kind of disciplined displays you see from North Korea or China, or I have to say, even from the British, who do this very well. We do it every year. It's called Trooping with the Colour, and it happened to coincide with King Donald's Big Beautiful Birthday Parade. Trooping with the Colour is, of course, the Big Beautiful Birthday Parade for King Charles's official birthday. And here we had an extremely disciplined and very well turned out military organisation showing how it's done and watched by people all over the world, as it is every year. It's something actually that the British do rather well. But it's one of the few times I've felt slightly sorry for Donald. But on the other hand, I guess it just showed how little enthusiasm there is,
Yeah.
certainly in the military, and frankly, even among American citizens, because it was hardly well attended, for these kind of sort of shows of might and power and wealth, and America, and even sort of America Great and so forth. I think there's actually much less enthusiasm for that in America than we in Britain sometimes realise. MAGA isn't everything.
Yeah. And from the media photos, we can see that like the protesters have got outnumbered than the viewers for the parade, So, Campbell.
Yeah, very much the same sort of reaction. There are real kings, and then there are sort of plastic McDonald's style kings, and they've gone rather differently. We're used to one, even if some of us don't approve of the approach in this island. It really was quite extraordinary. I think Bill Dare, alas, is no longer with us, but I think the scope for sort of satirical interpretation is now so extraordinary that the reality and the kid on are fused together in a really strange way. The No Kings protests have clearly garnered a lot of opposition interest, and even some from within the Republican Party seem in various states to have come out and protested that. Because, I mean, Trump has trashed the US Constitution. He's trashed actually significant parts of the progressive history of this country, his country. I don't mean Germany, I mean the US. And it's fascinating to see the way in which the Republican Party has been on Trump's coattails twice. And this time it's so much madder than it was. And it was telegraphed, not just from his first period in office, but from the 2025 program that was widely circulated. Even when he was disowning it, Trump was clearly all over it. He's selected a cabinet and a set of advisors of equally crazy people with very strange, disturbed views, some of them with interesting drug habits. It's an extraordinary coterie of people that are currently running, if that's the right language, the United States. It'll be interesting to see later on today, once he wakes up and has his Big Mac breakfast or whatever and his few cans of Coke, what he makes of his own parade and his own party, because the numbers were not great, but I imagine he will inflate them bigly because that is the way he behaves. But I think the media coverage, the photos, the newsreel, makes it pretty clear what was going on. As Francis said, it's not a particularly edifying or disciplined sight. But the No Kings demonstrations, some of which are about the Constitution and anti-Trump, and some of which are clearly also connected to opposition to the rounding up and imprisonment and illegal deportation of immigrants, how all of that will coalesce into actual opposition, actual change in the vibe in the US, who knows? But let's not get carried away with the comedic and the embarrassment side of this. I think this is serious, because the delusional world of Trump is a world that we are having to live in at the moment. And gosh, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in Alberta at the G7 just to hear exactly what is said to his face and what is said behind the hand. Because there are several people there who are pretty savvy. There are some like Macron and also the Italian Prime Minister, who have worked out a way of engaging with Trump. We all know that he loves to be flattered, so maybe they'll have to tell him what a fabulous idea his parade was. But there's an increasing horrible torque between what we understand and as the reality and what we are being presented with, and it really does jar. Yes, there's fun, there's comedy on the day, but actually what it means is that we are seeing the continued illness of the US. And again, how does this change? Because can this really go on for another 3.5 years? And what on earth will the world look like by the end of that? It's really it's quite scary. Whether it has a crown on its head or not, the US is in an extraordinarily bad state.
Yes. Having said that, yesterday's political assassination, it did not change Trump's mind not to do it or to dampen the celebration which he had. The political assassination in Minnesota did not change his mind at all. In any other country, they will even rethink about it, isn't it? Campbell?
Yeah, I'd agree. A normal president would have, even if it were to have come, to members of the other party. I mean, there would have been instant sort of statesmanship. There would have been sadness. There would have been commiseration. There would have been rising above, and we're going to make sure this doesn't happen. But he is increasingly setting up a situation where he wishes to be, as we saw in LA, at war with his own people if they're not on his side. And anybody who's a Democrat is not on his side. So I think we're seeing a ramping up of that. So actually, there's a potential convenience. I'm sure even in part of his brain, somebody on the opposition side being taken out, if I speak, obviously not meaning that to be a view about the people that have been killed or injured, but in his head, that's almost a good thing, because there is a narrative that can be constructed around that, because it's about dealing with opposition, and they're not relevant except where they help to extend his narrative. So for me, it's absolutely tragic that these events are occurring. But if senators can be wrestled to the floor and zip tied and taken out of buildings, if people can be arrested, or actually you can't arrest somebody if you're not actually quoting the law at them, but they're basically being quasi kidnapped. If that's the way in which he and his government and its agencies are behaving, we've really left the fairway. We're a long way off a sensible, logical, rational path. So yes, this did not bump him at all. I suspect this is just noise quietly in the background.
Thank you. Um, Francis, sorry. Would you like to add something into this?
Yeah, I think that I agree with what Campbell's saying about the division within US society and this increasing sort of view that the real people, the only people that matter, are the ones that support Donald Trump, and everybody else is an enemy, even from within, and therefore a legitimate target for all manner of repression. Now, that is characteristic of dictatorships, and that seems to be the direction in which America is going, and hence the attacks on the Constitution, because the Constitution was set up to prevent that happening, to prevent a king. Hence the No Kings protest. It's all about saying we set ourselves up. The whole point of the Republic, the Constitution, was not to have a king, and you want to set yourself up as a king. That's exactly what is going on. What I would add to that is that internal division of us versus them also reflects America's stance in the world. It's us versus them. And us are America and its allies, and in particular its very close allies. So Israel, particularly, is us. And then to some, the UK, maybe, and some European countries, maybe they seem quite keen on Germany. And then everybody else is them. And that's, in terms of global diplomacy and kind of just getting the world to work properly from an economic point of view, with trading relationships and things like that, that's not a healthy place to be. It's very hard to have healthy trading relationships with people you constantly keep treating as an enemy, and putting up barriers and imposing tariffs on them and threatening them and bullying them. You can't operate like that. And I think what we are seeing, and this is playing out in economics now, economically, what we are seeing and have been seeing for a while now, because of this very belligerent posturing from the US and the degree of chaos, frankly, that Trump's administration is sowing both within America and outside it, is actually a decline in trust in the United States. We're seeing that reflected in things like the yields on US Treasuries. US Treasuries used to be the safe haven asset that everybody ran to in times of trouble. Even in the financial crisis of 2008, which heaven knows was a financial crisis that started in the United States, people still ran to US Treasuries and to the dollar, because it was a safe place. And the only other two safe havens really are the Swiss franc, the Japanese yen, and gold. Now, Japanese yen is not as safe as it used to be, because there's inflation in Japan now, which there hadn't been for over 25 years. But more importantly, we're seeing the dollar falling, which is a sign that people are moving away from it. We're seeing the yields on US Treasuries rising, which is a sign that people are beginning to move away from them. And particularly with the trouble in Iran, we've seen US Treasury yields spiking, which suggests that people are actually running away from US Treasuries as a safe haven. They're expecting the US to be drawn into this war. And where people are going is still Swiss francs, but increasingly gold.
Yeah.
The world's just not a safe place anymore. When investors are treating gold as a safe haven, as the only safe haven really, the world is no longer a safe place.
Thank you so much.
And I would just add add one thing, which is something that I think is worth paying attention to.
Please.
Since the fall of the USSR in 1991, there has really only been one imperial power in the world. That's been the United States. It's worth paying attention to the fact that when empires fall, they do so suddenly. Campbell, you will remember the fall of the USSR. It was very sudden. And actually the fall of the British Empire in 1956 was also very sudden. This is pretty typical of how empires go. When you look back on it, you can see the strains developing, and the signs are there for years or decades before. But the actual fall happens suddenly, and it causes chaos. And I personally think that may be what we're seeing now.
Thank you. And we'll move on to the next topic. Why do some people blame others for their own misfortune? Why do some people prefer to target minorities with hate rather than welcome their contribution to building a better future? From Stockport to Ballymena, how much has UK government rhetoric contributed to riots targeting migrants? Florence? Sorry, Francis. I don't know why I'm calling you Florence. Francis, yes, yeah.
Um, this is a really hard question to answer, isn't it? But in fact, if you look back over the last almost 2 decades now, really, what we have seen is an increasing willingness to blame all manner of minorities and not just migrants for economic problems largely caused by government. So it started in the 2010s with the Scroungers and Shirkers. Do you remember that? A tax on single mothers, on benefits cheats,
Yeah.
people who weren't working for one reason or another. We've seen it develop with a tax on, we've still got that happening now with the proposed cuts to disability benefits, which are very much driven by a perception or whipped up hate, particularly on the right of politics. For some reason, the Labour government is trying to attract that people who are sick and disabled are shirking and not contributing and should be made to work. It is brutal, but it is driven by increasing, I guess, me among those who feel that, I guess, life is not treating them well, that the opportunities are not there. I would say, though, that the people who are really driving this and are those who fear they're going to have something taken away from them, which is, I think, why it is older people generally who are driving the hate against minorities, against migrants, against young people, frankly. Some of the things they say about young people are frankly horrible. Against people who are sick, people who are disabled. A lot of this comes from older people who fear that they are going to have what they have taken away from them. And I find this deeply worrying because if you look back to, for example, the Germany of the 1930s, it was the people who thought they were going to have something taken away from them who voted Hitler into power. I'm not saying that would happen here, but I'm seeing this kind of hatred towards minorities across the Western world. It's not just in the UK. And a rise of what I would call fascism. And it's I don't think it's going to end well. Maybe I'm just being unnecessarily pessimistic, but it just doesn't look very good. I think that minorities like this are often the bellwether for much more serious attacks on much larger groups, and we should pay attention to it.
Yeah, it is very painful. Campbell, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think the othering is an extraordinarily basic, tragically, human behavior, human psychological state that we, as we said about the US and about the Middle East, etc., there's the us and there's the them. And we, the Northern Ireland events were pretty extraordinary, but if you join the dots to Stockport and actually probably to a variety of things that were happening in other North of England cities and that previously happened closer to the Southern Channel ports, etc., etc., that if there is the possibility of the perception that they're getting something that we should be getting, or that we have something that these people are going to take away, then that feeds that sort of primal fear and the destructive behaviours that can potentially result from that. Now, policing has a lot to do with it. Education has a lot to do with it. Taking part of what Francis was saying, I suppose I do feel that Labour trying to steal some of the more extreme Tory clothing from the last 10 to 15 years, but also showing its fear of reform, given that that is now the preferred party of those with extremist right-wing anti-immigrant views that were previously in the Tory party and caused Cameron such difficulty because he was trying to manage a party that was being torn apart, and even things like I suspect both the Scottish referendum and the Brexit referendum had something to do with that, because there was an idea of trying to hold things together and we'll get the right result. And then, of course, when you get the wrong result, the schisms that come from that cause all sorts of problems. So Labour is trying to make sure that reform doesn't steal its votes and seats, and so it's tolerating or extending its values into the more extreme quasi-fascist lines of others. And because of what's happening in the US, it's more tolerable because, we're trying to bridge a gap and be nice to Trump so that he's not nasty to us. I think all of that feeds into the problem. Now, if you add in Northern Ireland old sectarian divides, as well as the issues of racism that can often accompany it, and put it into a border situation where you've got the Republic, which is part of Europe, and you've got Northern Ireland, which sort of isn't. Then you get the Britishness thing coming out, which, of course, unionism in Northern Ireland is even more extreme than most of the rest of the UK. So you've got a pretty toxic mix there. And if the politicians don't stand up to that quickly, if the media don't actually behave sensibly and objectively, and then they stir the pot both locally and at a wider level, then you have a really dangerous potential cocktail. So I see it requiring people to stiffen their spines and behave more honourably and give some leadership. And I think Starmer and co are really cowardly about much of this because they don't really want to offend anybody. They don't want to push people away from or towards certain things that they're worried about. So it's not a very happy situation. And I suppose I share Francis's concern that we are heading in the wrong direction. Now, often these things get exacerbated during summer. Hot weather, people can be out, blah. But I think the whole issue of how migrants are handled, what kind of accommodation they are offered whilst their applications are being processed, processing them more quickly and dealing with people in a more civilized manner, and actually realizing, as in the Scottish case, that we need new people, we need new skills, we need often the things that many of these migrants offer, not othering them, actually accommodating them in a capital A constructive manner. We could go on a very different path, but that would require high quality, mature, calm leadership. And I'm not sure we've got that, because what the media say is of too much interest, and what our allies politically say is also of too much concern, rather than necessarily doing the right thing, it seems to me.
Thank you, Campbell. And on that note, we will move on to the next topic. The Chancellor announced her spending review on Wednesday, with spending on defence, transport and science. Will this expenditure come at the expense of the poor, disabled and homeless, and how much will go to devolved governments in Barnett consequentials? And we will move on to the second question to that. Should the UK government be spending directly in the devolved areas by passing the Scottish government? Tucked away in her announcements, Rachel Reeves has effectively cut 2.5 billion from GB Energy's promised 8.3 billion budget to pay for the development of small nuclear reactors. Francis?
Wow, what a question. Yeah. I think we've got very used now to Rachel Reeves saying we have a really difficult fiscal situation and therefore there's all these things we can't do. She's been saying that since she got into office, and she's still, frankly, milking the mess Tory managed to make of the economy during Liz Truss's short-lived premiership. I wonder for how much longer she can milk that, because the policies she's pursuing are not significantly different from those pursued by Jeremy Hunt. She's doing more investment, which is welcome. We need more investment. I don't personally think it's enough, but at least she is doing some investment, which the Tories want. But apart from that, essentially, she's gone into war on certain groups. She's intending to inflict very harsh cuts indeed on sick and disabled people. Some of the cuts amount to literally thousands of pounds a year. I've seen for some of them, it will be over £10,000 a year of income. And these are not rich people. We're not talking about people living on like £200,000 a year for whom, £10,000 a year is, well, okay, that's a minor inconvenience. We're not talking about that. We're talking about people who are not rich. They are towards the bottom end of the income distribution. They're not the poorest. They're not the very poorest. They will become the very poorest. And they will become the very poorest because Rachel Reeves and Liz Kendall have decided that sick and disabled people need to live in poverty if they can't work. That the only people who deserve not to live in poverty, apart from pensioners, are people who can work. If you can't work, you are worthless. It is a very, very harsh utilitarian view, and I personally, speaking personally, oppose it with every fibre of my being. I think it's morally wrong. Across the board, we are seeing an increase in spending on the NHS. And that really is the biggest area of spending spending increase for the government, and it's going to be funded by cuts in other areas. Rather foolishly, they haven't put any extra money towards adult social care, which means that the money they're throwing at the NHS will actually get mopped up in compensating for the fact that there's effectively no adult social care, and also in increasing as the front line for the failures of other services in the community. So I think also this is a very short-sighted policy. I understand what drove it. The NHS is something of a sacred cow, and putting money into the NHS is enormously popular, and it is necessary. I mean, the NHS is in a mess. It needs more money. It needs more investment. It needs all sorts of things. But underneath it all is this kind of rigid adherence to a set of fiscal rules that she imposed, that she didn't have to, and she's imposing what I would call austerity on particular groups in order to fund it. This isn't, I think, what a Labour government should be doing, and I'd have to say that other economic think tanks, such as the National Institute, have criticised that approach profoundly and said that much more needs to be done to improve public services and support for the less fortunate of our society.
Thank you. Campbell?
Yeah, I mean, your question had a number of different elements in it about the nature of what becomes the Scottish budget, as well as the various UK dimensions. And I suppose I'd make a few points. I certainly agree with Francis about the sort of war on the poor, and it does seem as if the most obvious thing to do, i.e. small increases in those of great wealth, in their taxation, is just something they cannot quite conceive of, which I do not begin to understand. It seems a far more effective way of raising further funds. But tax is this strange sort of shibboleth, and Labour in the previous generation wanted to prove their bona fides that they would not, behave irresponsibly with the public finances. Well, given the level of debts that we are currently looking at and the amount of borrowing, that one went out the window a long time ago. So it almost feels as if the current account balancing has to be achieved by exploiting those who can't fight back, i.e. the poor and the disabled. So I think that is shocking. I think the settlement, we've got the usual war, the Jers related about, Scotland's getting all this extra money. And in fact, it's less than Barnett would have allocated, and it's certainly less than is needed. and they've wrapped up into it. I can't use the word that's in my head because it's not appropriate, but it's nonsense. We've got a rather limp version of the carbon capture and storage project for Peterhead. We've got extra money that's going to be spent in Fastlane for nuclear submarines, which we do not want. And there's money that's related to small modular nuclear reactors, which we certainly don't need. So there are all sorts of bits and pieces of nonsense around this, but actually the Scottish Government will, I imagine, continue in its rather dull, bureaucratic, administrative, managerial way to spend whatever money comes to it as effectively as possible with progressive social policies and other things, which I completely support. But they are, a fraction of the total economy of Scotland, which is still dominantly controlled from London. So we make the best of a kind of dodgy package because that's the best that we can do. But for a Labour government now to be, pro-nuclear, high carbon energy, doing nonsense that will not appear for another 20 years or longer in relation to managing climate change impacts, and hammering the poor whilst being awfully nice to the rich and to foreigners, i.e. foreign investors and offshore investment bodies and the US, etc., is just bonkers. I found myself during the week, as I heard David Lammy talking very slowly, trying to remember what he was supposed to be using as the government's lines, and thinking, what would Robin Cook make of this? What would a real foreign secretary do under those circumstances, caring about the global environment? It blew my head. So we are in an odd position, but Labour is not a recognisable party for me. And at the same time as we've lost the plot with Pax Americana, as Francis said, I'm at a loss to understand what's going on. I'm feeling very old.
And also they haven't funded their employer national insurance in Greece as well. There are a whole lot of things which we could discuss, but we are running out of time, unfortunately. Yeah, I'll just go to the wind up. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We face cost of over 4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around 2,500. We have raised over 10,500 this year so far. 14,000 less than we need to be on target to pay our bills every month, and we urgently need to raise as much as of 14k as possible immediately. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests, Campbell, Gemmell and Francis Coppola. Thank you, goodbye, and thank you for watching.